Hello, and welcome to today's episode of Talk on Things and Stuff. We have been exploring the life and some activities of Stuart Udall over the past few episodes, having gone through 5 of the 6 different articles in the Stuart Udall sequence. But before we get to the final sequence, I thought it would be good for us to go ahead and take a look at some of the articles that have been alluded to, which are found on the blog. They're written a few years earlier than the Stuart Udall sequence, but I think they provide some valuable background so that we can understand kind of everything that is brought to the table before we get to the last article in the Stuart Udall sequence. So that is what we're going to do today. So let's go ahead and dive right into it. I'm, as we've done before, going to be reading the article so that I can capture the audio for a subsequent podcast version of it. And we'll just start. Okay, this is the Lowry Nelson Exchange, written November 30th, 2013. It is noted that there is a follow-up article covering the Cuba report of Heber Meeks that we will also be going over in the coming days. It provides some important context to the events described in this article. All right. As a practicing Mormon, what happens if, through careful study and introspection, you come to the determination that your conscience and convictions are diametrically opposed to a key aspect of church doctrine? You might chuckle to yourself, imagining this possibility. After all, if born into the church, your identity has been formed while saturated in church society and doctrine. How could you have any significant differences? The modern example of Mormon women wearing pants to church or praying in general conference are hardly key doctrine, but the movement to ordain women to the priesthood is pretty much spot on. Most Mormons have probably only considered this movement enough to dismiss it as completely outlandish. More recently, the excommunication of Kate Kelly, founder of Ordain Women, has brought this question into focus for many Mormons who share her concerns and would like a prophetic statement on the matter. Suppose that you were to be so bold as to write to the First Presidency and make your case, appealing to them to change the church's attitude on this issue. How would that be received? Would it be the modern-day equivalent to steadying the ark? It would be fascinating to see what would happen if someone made such an argument about a key point of doctrine to the highest levels of church authority. Once upon a time. It turns out that someone has. Deep within the archives of the Deep within the archives of Utah State University, in a few boxes of dusty folders and papers, lies the collection of personal writings and communications of Dr. Lowry Nelson. Dr. Nelson was an internationally respected LDS sociologist working at the Utah State Agricultural College, now known as Utah State University. In 1947, when he had the opportunity to exchange letters with the First Presidency under Prophet George A. Smith on the topic of Mormon doctrine and policy towards black people. Careful examination of this exchange presents a unique snapshot of the thoughts and attitudes of Mormon members and leaders struggling with how to deal with the issues of race as seen from a societal and religious perspective. Meek inquiry. Years previously, Dr. Nelson had been schoolmates with a man named Heber Meeks. Each had parted to their own career, and Meeks was subsequently given the position of mission president to the Southern States Mission. In this capacity, Meeks was given the special task of exploring the possibilities for establishing a missionary presence in Cuba in 1947. He visited Cuba, becoming familiar with the culture and society, and while there learned that his old schoolmate Lowry Nelson had recently spent a year in Cuba as part of a study for the State Department. Upon his return to the States, he wrote a letter, which you can see the full letter scanned at archive.org. He wrote a letter to Dr. Nelson asking for his insights into the potential for church asking for his insights into the potential for the church moving into Cuba. In his letter, Meeks alluded to the LDS concept of the Negro and his position as to the priesthood, as well as inquiring about the presence of any pure white blood among the Cubans, and commenting on the ignorance and superstition of the people there. All of these allusions reflected conventional LDS attitudes towards race at the time in 1947. Dr. Nelson responds. Dr. Nelson, having devoted his life to the study of how societies of different races and backgrounds evolve and interact with each other, responded, and you can see the full scanned response at archive.org. He responded with very pointed statements about his convictions on the matter. Quote, "The attitude of the church in regard to the Negro makes me very sad," unquote. He admitted that he did not realize that the position of blacks in the church represented an official fixed doctrine. He wrote, "I do not believe God is a racist." Nelson, I'm starting again. "I do not believe God is a racist," Nelson wrote bluntly. He further clarified that, according to anthropologists, there are no pure races. He went on to state that the church's doctrine amounted to white supremacy, and observed that there was currently less racial inequality and prejudice in Cuba than existed in parts of the United States. He ultimately concludes that if the church does not change its stance on the issue of race, he believed it would become, He ultimately concludes that if the church does not change its stance on the issue of race, he believed that it would do more harm than good to bring such a theology into the country and introduce racism where there was not any previously, or sanction it where it did. Dr. Nelson felt that the issue was significant enough that he copied and sent both Meeks' original letter and his own reply to the First Presidency of the Church, hoping for clarification on the matter. The First Presidency replies. The First Presidency, under George A. Smith, took the opportunity to respond by letter, and you can read the full letter at archive.org. They clarified church doctrine and reinforced a proper view of race in the mind of Dr. Nelson. It's particularly interesting to note whether they saw this issue as a matter of doctrine or a matter of policy. At the outset, the First Presidency clarified exactly what they were addressing. The basic element of your ideas and concepts seems to be that all God's children stand in equal position before Him in all things. In response to this assertion, they set out to correct this notion in the mind of Dr. Nelson, stating, and this is reading from their response, quote, "This is contrary to the very fundamentals of God's dealings with Israel, dating from the time of his promise to Abraham regarding Abraham's seed and their position vis-a-vis God himself. Indeed, some of God's children were assigned to superior positions before the world was formed." First Presidency letter to Lowry Nelson. They further go on to explain that the role of the first estate, or premortal life, They further go on to explain the role that the first estate, or premortal life, plays in relation to race, stating, reading from the letter again, quote, "Your position seems to lose sight of the revelations of the Lord touching the pre-existence of our spirits, the rebellion in heaven, and the doctrines that our birth into this life and the advantages under which we may be born have a relationship in the life heretofore." To explain the implications of this regarding the priesthood and to remove any doubt as to whether these ideas are folklore or church doctrine, they continue. Reading again from the letter. "From the days of the prophet Joseph even until now, it has been the doctrine of the church, never questioned by any of the church leaders, that the Negroes are not entitled to the full blessings of the gospel." Now, after squarely trouncing Dr. Nelson's position, they focus on what they perceive to be a significant danger alluded to by his ideas, interracial marriage. Reading again from their response. "Furthermore, your ideas, as we understand them, appear to contemplate the intermarriage of the Negro and white races, a concept which has heretofore been most repugnant to most normal-minded people from the ancient from the ancient patriarchs till now. God's rule for Israel, his chosen people, has been endogamous. Now they continue to warn of the worldly influences which are trying to break down this prohibition, stating, quote, "We are not unmindful of the fact that there is a growing tendency, particularly among some educators, as it manifests itself in this area, towards the breaking down of race barriers in the matter of intermarriage between whites and blacks. But it does not have the sanction of the church and is contrary to church doctrine." That's the end of that quote. Now, they clearly identify this restriction on interracial marriage as a matter of doctrine. Dr. Nelson's bold reply to the prophet. What is a faithful Latter-day Saint to do when completely and utterly reproved by God's mouthpiece? Any normal, well-behaved Mormon would and should bow their head and say yes. But Nelson would have none of that. He wrote back and made a forceful and powerful argument based on sociology, scripture, ethics, and morality. Societies change, institutions resist. He begins by pointing out the dynamic character of society. This is reading from Lowry Nelson's reply to the prophet. As one studies the history and characteristics of human societies, one soon comes to realize, starting again, one soon comes to recognize certain principles. One of these is the social... Let me start this quote again because I'm messing it up. As one studies the history and characteristics of human societies, one soon comes to recognize certain basic principles. One of these is social change. Any given society over the years undergoes changes. It is forever in a state of flux. Now, contrasting to this observation, Lowry goes on to add, another principle which stands out as one studies the development of cultures is the tendency of institutions to resist change. Although they are established or grow up originally as a means to the end of satisfying the needs of man, they, the institutions, tend to become ends in themselves. Now, turning to a scriptural example, Dr. Nelson points out that the Pharisees represented this type of institutional entrenchment in Christ's time, and Christ himself spoke of this danger. Reading from Nelson's reply, quote, "It seems to me that Jesus was trying to get this point over to the society of his day when he spoke of putting new wine in old bottles, and that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. This was an affront to the legalism of the Pharisees and others of similar outlook." And that's the end of that part of the letter. Ethnocentrism ain't just a river in Egypt. Now, Dr. Nelson then explains the concept of ethnocentrism, or the worldview that one's own group is the center of everything, and all others are sealed and rated with reference to it. He states that this in or out thinking leads to the in-group assigning everything else an inferior status, and that this tendency exists in all groups. He goes on to make several observations of biblical history in the context of these ideas of social change and ethnocentrism, explaining that the Old Testament records an evolving understanding of God and his relationship to man. He points out that the Hebrews' attitudes towards other races represents an early point in their social evolution. However, since it was recorded in its scriptural history, the attitudes on race were given an aura of the sacred, which serves to lock these ideas against the flow of a progressive society. Nelson contrasts the notion of racial inequality with modern standards, stating, quote, "It does not square with what seems an acceptable standard of justice today, nor with the letter or spirit of the teachings of Jesus Christ. I cannot find any support for such a doctrine of inequality in his recorded sayings." The seed of war. Having made a case based on sociology and scripture, Nelson goes on to point out that one of the chief causes of war is the existence of ethnocentrism, and that war is our major social evil which threatens to send all of us to destruction. The nation had just experienced the horror of World War II and seen the result of the extreme racial superiority doctrine of Nazi Germany. To Nelson, the seed of that evil was germinating in the racial inequality espoused by the Church, and it needed to be corrected. Quote, "We can ameliorate these feelings of ethnocentrism by promoting understanding of one people by others," Nelson continued. Unlikely allies. He described the discomfort he felt at the doctrines of my own church, which says in effect that white supremacy is part of God's plan for his children, and the fact that on the issue of the race, and on the fact that on the issue of race, this places the church among the ranks of the most reprobate bigots in America. Quote, "This makes us nominal allies of the Rankins and Bilbos of Mississippi, a quite unhappy alliance for me, I assure you." Real-world implications. If the doctrine on race that the First Presidency espoused was true, then the most degenerate white person alive has a hope for salvation that exceeds the most accomplished and pious black soul. Nelson conjures up several examples to point out this injustice. Quote, "Dr. George Washington Carver, the late eminent and saintly Negro scientist, is by virtue of the color of his skin inferior even to the least admirable white person, not because of the virtues he may or may not possess, but because through no fault of his there is a dark pigment in his skin." He goes on to point out how this doctrine may apply to the entire Indian nation and others who may live more pious lives than many of the saints themselves. Social side of the gospel. Finally, Dr. Nelson calls out the First Presidency for attempting to separate the social side of the gospel from the rest. Quoting from the letter, "Now, you say that the social side of the restored gospel is only an incident of it. It is not the end thereof. I may not have the same concept of social as you had in mind, but it seems to me the only virtue we can recognize in men that is expressed in their relations with others is their social relations. Are the virtues—" unfortunately, I read that wrong, so I have to start again. "I may not have had the same concept of social as you had in mind, but it seems to me the only virtue we can recognize in men is that expressed in their relations with others, that is, their social relations. Are the virtues of honesty, chastity, humility, forgiveness, tolerance, love, kindness, justice secondary? If so, what is primary? Love of God? Very well, but the second law is like unto it." His final plea is for the First Presidency to avoid the trap of legalism that Christ condemned the Pharisees for. Reading again from his response, "Are we becoming so legalistic after the fashion of the Pharisees that we cannot adjust our institutions to the changing needs of mankind? Are we, as some have charged, more Hebraic than Christian?" Modern Mormons reading Dr. Nelson's letter can see the clear and abundant truth that he is pleading to the powers that guide the church to see for themselves. Society had moved beyond racial inequality that was still enshrined in the institution that bore the name of Jesus Christ, and it was the men at the top who had the power to rectify it. How would a prophet respond to such truth boldly proclaimed from the pews of the congregation to the pulpit on high? The First Presidency bites back. A few months after the First Presidency, A few months later, the First Presidency issues a terse reply to Dr. Nelson. It was short and direct. Reading from that reply, "We feel very sure that you understand well the doctrines of the Church. They are either true or not true. Our testimony is that they are true. Under these circumstances, we may not permit ourselves to be too much impressed by the reasonings of men, however well-founded they may seem to be. We should like to say this to you in all kindness and in all sincerity, that you are too fine a man to permit yourself to be led off from the principles of the gospel by worldly learning. You have too much of a potentiality for doing good, and we therefore prayerfully hope that you can reorient your thinking and bring it in line with the revealed word of God." That's how a prophet responds. Your leaders know what's true. All of your worldly learning has led you astray. Get back in line. Nelson makes it public. Now, such a complete and utter reproof from the highest religious authority, even after an impassioned rejoinder, would quell even the most stalwart of saints. Dr. Nelson, apparently, was not one to learn such a lesson when taught from on high. Several years later, in 1952, after admittedly joining other saints in ruminating and contemplating this issue of racial inequality in a church that they otherwise held dear, Nelson authored an essay titled Mormonism and the Negro for publication in the popular magazine The Nation. This was a periodical whose audience extended far beyond the small community of Mormons. Such airing of dirty laundry in front of the entire nation was a clear end run around the prophet, an appeal to mass sentiment. I recommend that you read the essay linked above for yourself. And at this point, it's not a terribly long essay, so we're going to go ahead and read it. There's a scanned version of it, and we'll see if we can get enough of it to read it. This is from the magazine The Nation in 1952. Around the USA, Mormons and the Negro. According to Mormon theology, the status of the Negro on earth was determined in the pre-existent state, specifically in the war in heaven. As everyone knows, Lucifer rebelled and was cast down, taking with him 1/3 of the hosts of heaven. These are the sons of perdition. Michael clearly had a majority with him, some more active supporters than others. Although I can find no scriptural basis for it, I have heard it said that Although I can find no scriptural basis for it, I have heard it said that the active pro-Michael group was no more than 1/3. The other third sat on the fence, refusing to take sides. The latter, in the Mormon lore of my boyhood days, was identified as the Negro. This places him in a sort of never-never land, a twilight zone between the satanic hosts and those who were ready to be counted on the side of Michael. Thus, the blessings of the Mormon Church cannot be extended to anyone with Negro blood. This unfortunate policy of the Church is a source of embarrassment and humiliation to thousands of its members, the writer among them, who find no basis for it in the teachings of Jesus, whom all Mormons accept as the Savior. The issue has become increasingly important as members of the Church outside of Utah and adjacent states have increased rapidly in recent years and are brought into direct contact with Negroes and who see their fellow Christians engaged in programs to reduce racial prejudice, programs in which they cannot fully participate. Such persons would like to see the policy altered in the interest of peace and simple humanitarianism. The doctrine of white race superiority, so much in the vogue in the early 19th century when Mormonism had its beginning, has been so thoroughly debunked as to catalog its adherents today as either grossly uninformed or victims of traditional irrational prejudices, or both. Mormons as a group are not ignorant people. They rank high in formal schooling, with an extraordinarily high proportion of college graduates. Many of them naturally find it difficult to reconcile what they learn in college about racial differences and inequalities with the what they learn in college about racial differences and equalities with the stand taken by their church. Curiously, the position of the Church on the Negro does not carry over to other racial groups. Natives of the South Seas, Mongolians, and American Indians are given a clean bill of health, and Mormons, according to their theology, regard the Jews as their own kin. The doctrine, however, does not mean there is no anti-Semitism among Mormons, but that is another problem. The basic question remains as to whether the Church will modify its present stand on this matter. Perhaps a more important question is, can it change? Theoretically, the Church has a means by which its doctrines may be modified. It was founded upon the idea of progressive revelation, that as God spoke to the people in Bible days, so he continues to do so today through the head of the Church. An announcement ex cathedra on this question would be accepted by the body of the Church, joyfully by some, although no doubt reluctantly by others. It is recognized, of course, that it is very difficult for a religion based upon revelation to modify its doctrine, but few other denominations have the same procedures for change that the Mormon Church has. The leaders of this church are men of goodwill. It is difficult to believe that deep in their own hearts they are not troubled by the ethical problem which this bit of dogma presents. A very real difficulty is the fact that those who disapprove the Church's attitude have no way of expressing their point of view. It is safe to say that most of the 1 million members give passive assent to the present policy. Most of those living in Utah and adjacent states, For most of those living in Utah and adjacent states, the Negro question is academic. They hardly ever see Negroes, much less live in the same community with them. In any case, they would find comfortable agreement with the white supremacy ideas because of latent historical prejudices which they share with so many other white people. However, my knowledge of the deep humanitarianism of the Mormon people leads me to think that if the question could be openly discussed, they would line up on the side of justice. Such open discussion, especially in print, however, is a perilous undertaking for any member. It automatically leaves him open to the charge of disobedience to the constituted authority, which may lead to his being excommunicated. It automatically leaves him open to the charge of disobedience to constituted authority, which may lead to his being excommunicated. The upshot is that discussions by interested persons are largely sub rosa. So widespread are such discussion groups that they might be said to constitute a Mormon underground. The participants are not disloyal church members. Rather, they are generally active in the church and rationalize their conduct by weighing the many admirable features of their religion against the features with which they disagree. In writing this article for publication, the author does so in a spirit of constructive criticism and in the conviction that his church, with so many admirable qualities and achievements to its credit, is faced by a challenge to place itself alongside those other groups which are laboring against racial bigotry. Lowry Nelson. The writer is a lifelong member of the Mormon Church. All right, let's continue back. I recommend you read the essay linked above for yourself. In his essay, Dr. Nelson laid out the Mormon doctrine and unchallenged folklore that justifies giving black members a second-tiered status in the church. He also points out how utterly archaic and debunked the notion of racial superiority is, and how it contrasts with the members of the church who are intelligent and compassionate, not the backcountry yokels that are usually associated with notions of white supremacy. He further describes how the strong hierarchy of authority in the church mutes any rational discourse on these sensitive issues among the membership, revealing that members have had to hold these discussions in secret, forming a sort of Mormon underground. Among these expositions, Nelson does something subtle and masterful. He changes the terms of the discussion. The First Presidency had forcefully declared that the position of the church in this issue was a matter of doctrine. This should be the final word to any believing Mormon, because doctrine is equivalent to God's law, which is unchanging and everlasting. It is truth. It is truth. In his essay, Nelson describes the matter in terms of policy. This allows much greater flexibility in interpretation on an issue to a Mormon because policy represents man-made programs in support of doctrine and is not given the aura of finality and truth that doctrine is afforded. By calling the issue a matter of policy, Nelson is opening a wide gate to allow the church to change while maintaining its authoritative integrity. Mark Twain is quoted as saying that it is better to hold one's tongue and be thought an idiot than to open one's mouth and remove all doubt. In writing this essay, Dr. Nelson was removing all doubt from the minds of In writing this essay, Dr. Nelson was removing all doubt from the minds of the non-Mormon world that in its current state, the LDS Church is clearly in the camp of white supremacy, and the powers at its head are entrenched in that position. His shift of the issue to one of policy lays the groundwork for the change that would ultimately come. Parting shot by the First Presidency. Between their exchange of letters and the essay published in The Nation, President George A. Smith had died and been succeeded by the new prophet, David O. McKay. As a courtesy to the First Presidency, Nelson sent them a copy of his article and his intention to have it published. He received a reply, which you can see scanned on archive.org, a reply from the Secretary to the First Presidency, reading, quote, "President McKay wishes me to say that obviously you are entirely within your rights to publish any article you wish. I should like to add on my own account, however, that when a member of the Church sets himself up against doctrines preached by the prophet Joseph Smith and by those who have succeeded him in the high office which he held, he is moving into a very dangerous position for himself personally." And that's what you face when you know in your heart what is right and you appeal to church authority to rectify it. Change at last. It would be over a quarter of a century, 26 years later, that President Spencer W. Kimball and the Quorum of the 12 Apostles would receive a revelation to allow blacks to receive all the blessings of the gospel. When they did so and the apostles went on speaking rounds to do damage control, they took the cues that Nelson provided and called it a change of policy, not doctrine. They attributed all the old ways of thinking to folklore rather than Scripture. Subsequent prophets have so far distanced themselves from the heady pronouncements of their predecessors that they stumble over each other. Just compare the following statements. From Brigham Young, quote, "You see some classes of the human family that are black, uncouth, uncomely, disagreeable, and low in their habits, wild, and seemingly deprived of nearly all the blessings of intelligence that is generally bestowed upon mankind. That curse will remain upon them, and they never can hold the priesthood or share in it until all the other descendants of Adam have received the promises and enjoyed the blessings of the priesthood and the keys thereof." This is a discourse from Brigham Young from 1859, found in the Journal of Discourses. Now, take that and contrast it to this statement from Gordon B. Hinckley in 2005, quote, "I remind you that no man who makes disparaging remarks concerning those of another race can consider himself a true disciple of Christ, nor can he consider himself to be in harmony with the teachings of the Church of Jesus Christ. How can a man holding the Melchizedek priesthood arrogantly assume that he is eligible for the priesthood, whereas another who lives a righteous life but whose skin is of a different color is ineligible?" Gordon B. Hinckley from the General Conference Address, The Need for Greater Kindness, May 2005, Ensign edition. Other general authorities appear to have a void in their memory or are complicit in a remarkable whitewashing campaign. Quote, "How grateful I am that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has from its beginning stood strongly against racism in any of its malignant manifestations." From 70 Alexander Morrison, an article called "No More Strangers" in the Ensign, published September 2000. Change came, but what did it reveal about those men who sit at the seat of power in the church that bears Christ's name? Lessons for today. How does the experience of Dr. Nelson reflect on the plight of the modern Mormon? Was the doctrine or policy of racial inequality the only injustice ingrained into LDS theology? The people who are today crying out for women to be ordained to the priesthood may see Nelson's experience as a proof that just the right amount of social pressure can help the prophets ask the right questions of God to effect change. There is no argument that was made in favor of blacks receiving the priesthood that could not also be made in favor of women receiving it. People concerned about how homosexuals are received in the church have already harvested the first bounty of their efforts. The church has gone from declaring that being gay is a choice made by people ensnared by iniquity to acknowledging that people are born with same-sex attraction. The attitudes of church members are slowly coming around, and gay men and women who do not act on their attractions can be temple recommend holding, temple going, temple tithing paying members in good standing. These different observations may lead some people to conclude that the First Presidency is able to ask God about the important issues of the day and receive God's truth in return, a justification and triumph for the Mormon tenet of continued revelation. Thus, people like Dr. Nelson may be seen as pioneers who blaze a trail and return to ask the prophet if this or that direction is not the one that God would have us go. My own feelings on the matter are different. Several people have lamented that this account should be seen by more Orthodox members, but my conclusions would tend to negate the value of the rest of the article. If you are in an organization which discourages you or makes you discourage yourself from being exposed to opinions or ideas, then you may want to contemplate why that is. Nevertheless, I have condensed my more controversial editorial statements in the expandable boxes below. If your sensibilities are too tender to hear opinions that are not your own or given to you from properly constituted authorities, then feel free to bypass them. Otherwise, you may expand the box below if you care to see them and judge for yourself. Editorial Perspective. To me, these observations demonstrate that it is men, not God, who are at the head of the organization that bears Christ's name. Would a priesthood bearing the name and power of God block an entire race from its blessings in the first place? If you could make an argument to change the nature of priesthood rights, whether to blacks or to women or to gays, wouldn't that expose the fact that such a priesthood could not originate from God in the first place? As such, why would you want to pursue it at all? Conclusion. I have spent a few posts writing about why, despite the good things the Mormon Church does, there is danger in simply turning a blind eye to problems that are revealed through a careful study of LDS church history. Nelson's story is one of the clearest examples of this danger. If you allow men to stand between you and God, telling you what is proper and true against your own God-given conscience, you set yourself up to be abused and to abuse others. There is more to be said through my own perspective. Expand below if you're interested. The idea that an individual may determine spiritual truth based on their own conscience, their relationship with God, and personal study of history, both secular and religious, is anathema to the Mormon idea of a restored gospel and restored priesthood authority. Adherence to the faith will warn you away from such self-serving and prideful notions. They will warn you that evil influences will tempt and tease you away from those rules and standards that the properly constituted authorities have drawn from on high. Dr. Nelson's experience demonstrates that the well that those authorities draw from is just as corrupt as any other. Dr. Nelson exposed that the hubris and prejudice of these powerful men leads them to close their minds to all counsel but their own. Dr. Nelson pointed out that he could see the naked body of the emperor without explicitly saying that it was the lack of clothing which exposed it. People born and raised in the church after 1978 may have no idea that this legacy exists. They may be forgiven for not seeing. I cannot imagine how those who were alive at the time could be blind to this. Now that these events are brought out into public view through the internet, each of us must decide what to make of the implications. And after the article was published, there was a bunch of different responses, and a few addendums were in order. And so we'll go through those. Addendum 1, Choice versus Nature. The principle that makes Dr. Nelson's arguments so powerful is the modern idea that a person's race is beyond their control. Mormon theology is firmly entrenched in a legalistic works-based perspective, with grace there to pick up the slack. To a Mormon, the heavens reward the righteous and punish the wicked in this life or the next. The narrative makes a sort of bizarre logical sense, explaining the First Presidency's arguments about the preexistence. In the preexistence, this life was the next life. The narrative articulated by church leaders after the 1978 revelation is that people's race and other disadvantages have absolutely nothing to do with premortal righteousness. People are not punished for things that are beyond their control. So if we look at the spectrum of the features of human existence that are beyond one's control, several important issues stand out. The example of their changing stance on blacks and the priesthood demonstrates that when the church acknowledges that something is genetic and not determined by one's own choice, church policy may be amended to take this into account. As I alluded previously, the church has modified its stance on homosexuality. In 1978, Apostle Boyd K. Packer declared that homosexuality was a state of unnatural temporary temptation. You can see the pamphlet called To the One. Whereas the recently released website mormonsandgays.org, approved by Apostle Oakes and Christofferson, declares that individuals do not choose to have such attractions. The church has gone from a position of declaring one's gayness to be an unnatural choice to a position where gayness is a phenomena of nature beyond one's volition. If someone cannot be held accountable, punished, or deprived of the full blessings of the gospel as a result of their race, which is beyond their control, how then will the church deal with someone who is gay beyond their control? For now, the answer is that they can still receive those blessings so long as they do not act on the natural attraction which nature has given them. The unspoken paradox is that nature is simply God. If this is true of gays, what of women? Their identity as women is not an act of choice, but of chromosomes and genetics, nature, something beyond their control. Are the full blessings of the gospel to be kept from them as well? Certainly they have the benefit of the priesthood now, so long as they have access to a righteous male priesthood holder. What of the blessings of shepherding a ward, of counseling a troubled sister, of ministering to the sick? These acts of service are a blessing to those who assist the Lord in his work. Why should they be denied to 50% of God's children due to something beyond their control? These arguments are rhetorical. To me, they do not create an impetus to agitate for women or gays to receive the priesthood. They simply point out the nature of the counterfeit. When close inspection reveals the dull, dark, worthless metal beneath the glittering superficial gold plating attempting to gild the defect is an act of denial. A fraudulent coin is worthless even when the telling defects are concealed once more. Addendum 2. Since the publication of this article, the Church has released an essay on LDS.org titled Race and the Priesthood. In this article, unnamed authors describe many theories which had been proposed by past church leaders as the reason for the ban on blacks receiving the priesthood and temple covenants. The article specifically cites the same reasons that the prophet described to Nelson Lowry as doctrine in the above exchange, namely concepts of race being the result of premortal actions and that mixed-race marriages are repugnant. The essay states, quote, "Today, the church disavows the theories advanced in the past that black skin is a sign of divine disfavor or curse, or that it reflects actions in a premortal life, that mixed-race marriages are a sin, or that blacks or people of any other race or ethnicity are inferior in any way to anyone else. Church leaders today unequivocally condemn all racism, past and present, in any form." Since the position of the church is that all these notions are incorrect theories, then it means that Lowry Nelson's letters to the First Presidency actually contained God's truth. You see from the above description that everything Nelson wrote is absolutely accepted by the church today. The prophet then specifically rejected the truth and held fast to false doctrine. Now, there are many people who have been deeply troubled by the race and priesthood essay for this very reason. It certainly causes one to contemplate the ability of church leaders to discern truth from error, and those who see this may view Kate Kelly's Ordained Women movement in a different, more empathetic light. All right, we got through it. Let's see here. Okay, so let me set things up so that we can take calls. If anyone's interested in calling in for that, give me just a second. I should have like some theme music playing for you now, do 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 do, but I don't. All right, so we'll stop screen sharing there, and we'll go to this, share audio, and include voice share. And we'll go ahead and put up the number. So if you have any comments or want to share your perspective on this, then we will invite you to call 210-422-2222. And we'll be able to have a discussion about that. In the meantime, let's see what comments have come in. All right. One viewer says, the idea is that we are the chosen people and in the most important dispensation of time and in the land that is blessed above all others reflect our ethnocentrism. Absolutely. I think you can look at the line that is divided between us and them, and you can see where it changes in Mormonism. You know, back at the time that Dr. Nelson was writing these letters, the line between us and them most clearly was defined as white members of the church and everybody else. Whether you were black members of the church, you're still on the other side of the most special line. And with each of these different changes, they just kind of change where it is. You know, then it was, okay, we've now considered black people to be equal to us, so now the line is everybody else outside the church and everybody inside the church. And then a few more years go on and the church adopts a more ecumenical stance towards other religions. It no longer considers the Catholic Church to be the great and abominable whore and starts aligning with other churches under the heading of protecting religious freedom because they find that their more hateful doctrines are under attack by society. And so now we can start to say that the line between us and them is more on, you know, religious people or spiritual people, the people who are faithful versus the atheists. And even beyond that, you can talk about this dispensation and the chosen generation. And in every situation, it just has the effect of endorsing a black and white perspective of yourself in the in-group and other people. It's a very simplistic way of looking at things, and it's one of the more manipulative things that you'll find in any of these different groups because they want to give you a sense of specialness for belonging among the favored people, and it justifies your existence, and it gives you a kind of a combative or adversarial attitude towards everybody else on the outside. They're either potential converts, or if they reject you, then they are the enemy. It's very easy to attribute that to a cult-like mentality when you see the Jehovah's Witnesses do it or the Scientology do it. It's a little bit harder when you live inside the breathing world of Mormonism and are faced with that yourself. I think one of the things that was very helpful to me early on was really understanding this concept of ethnocentrism, because if you look at it only at the lens of race, then you miss out on the fact that there are ways that human beings segment each other off from other people that are lines that are drawn through things other than race, but the same sort of principles apply in terms of how you dehumanize other people. And so this aspect of ethnocentrism can pivot on the notion of race, it can pivot on nationality, it can pivot on political platform, it can pivot on any number of different things that you isolate each other from, like sports teams. You know, you got BYU versus the other team. I don't know the other team. All right. Next comment. The LDS Church prides itself in being run from the top down. There is into a person in the pews. That is a very obvious reality of the church to anyone that lives in it. And it's so different when you maybe venture out and see some of the other church paradigms. You know, growing up in the church myself, I had this idea. I just assumed that every other church had the exact same structure of authority. You know, the Catholic Church has the Pope, he's kind of like the prophet, and then the line of authority goes down from there. And I just kind of assumed that every other church had the same structure. And it was only really after I started studying and learning that there's this whole menu of ways that churches can be organized. If you just Google ecclesiastical polity, you'll find that there are several different paradigms for how people coming together under one faith heading may organize themselves into a support system that supports their faith and their community. And, you know, groups that come together that retain the ability to make determinations and decisions on doctrinal concepts and ideas, on how their finances are managed, on what degree of transparency and accountability the leaders have. they're able to be much more flexible and adapt to how society changes and becomes more enlightened, particularly around the issues of racism in the past and how we're dealing with other issues in the modern era. And we're still seeing that organizations are wrestling with this. There's still major churches that are experiencing schisms or fraction out of, the question of whether or not gay individuals should be able to marry, whether they should be accepted among the leadership of the church. All right. If you have any comments, feel free to call 210-422-2222. We'll be elated to hear from you. Neil Douglas says, the church started out with the law of common consent, which has essentially become a useless ritual. And that's absolutely true. In the past, when you look at the history of the church, the law of common consent was a way for the general membership of the church to have a form of check or veto on actions or changes that the leadership would make. And if you go back in time, you can see that there were some decisions early on in the church in terms of the priesthood brethren getting support from the church financially and some other changes that when they brought it up for common consent, it was voted down. And so the people were able to actually have a position different from what the leaders were trying to do, and it kept the leadership in a position where there was a measure of accountability to the membership. But today, that concept has been completely thrown out, and now it is our privilege. This is the way the leaders tell us. It's your privilege to sustain the leaders. And so when you go and you raise your hand to sustain the leaders, they say, okay, well, that's common consent. But the cultural expectation is that sustaining votes means that whatever the leaders do, they do it with the will and support of the members because we support them, we sustain them. And so there's never any point at which you can actually be critical of the church leaders or hold them accountable for things. If we were to discover that the church was paying hundreds of millions of dollars out to child abuse victims who had been abused by church leaders or who the church failed in some way to protect children, then we might say that that was a sign that there was a significant problem that needed to be addressed in the church. But we have no visibility on that because of the church's opaque financial position. And we have no way to demand of our leaders that opaque financial position change to one of transparency and accountability. And so the Mormon Church really holds its members in a position of absolute subservience to the leaders. There's nothing that the people in the pews can do to get the people in the red chairs at the front to actually change. It seems outside of embarrassing them through social media and through going to the press when the problems happen. We've seen the example in Lowry Nelson and in Stuart Udall where, these people did not write public articles to the nationwide newspapers first. They did go behind the scenes to try to present the brethren with a more enlightened way, with a way that was more in tune with the secular learning of the world, with wider society's understanding of universal brotherhood. But the brethren held on to their false doctrine rather than move with those changes. And so the only recourse left to Lowry Nelson and Stuart Udall was to appeal to the public to see if public sentiment placing pressure on the brethren would lead them to change. And that's exactly what's happened. And if you pay attention to what's going on now, that seems to be what's happening on more modern issues around how LGBT individuals are treated and accepted within the church. Again, you can call 210-410, let's see here, 210-422-2222 if you want to call and join us on the show with your comments. Why do most current members put up with previous leaders and doctrines being thrown under the bus? Well, I think the church has found a really good way to do that, and that is the restoration is ongoing. That buzzword, Nelson was a big fan of the covenant path, but I think he's even a bigger fan of the ongoing restoration, which basically means we can change whatever. We can hold to the idea that we're teaching you the truth now, for this time, and the people back then were teaching you the truth then for that time, because the restoration is ongoing. We're only held accountable for the truth to which we have been given. And so it's a form of doublethink, where we're supposed to believe that these men are the spokesmen for God, and implicit in that is the idea that God would convey the most important and pressing principles to his spokesperson. And if that was the case, then it would have been much, much earlier that the church would have come to an enlightened position on race. But it doesn't happen. Neil Douglas says, now you have to start a fire in order to have a voice, not a healthy position for the church. And I think this is what is alluded to both in Nelson's letter in The Nation here, as well as in Stuart Udall's pieces, which is that there is no space inside of acceptable Mormonism to talk about issues for which there are differing opinions on things that the brethren have declared to be policy or doctrine. The church has recently come out with a new handbook, and it's redefined what apostasy is. And one of the things that previously apostasy was just speaking out against the leaders or doctrine of the church, but now they've made it that apostasy is speaking out against leaders, doctrine, or policy. So these things that are policy, if leaders are vocal in their criticism of policies that the church has enacted, then they are counting themselves as apostate. And the church manual is informing the membership of the church that they should view anyone who criticizes policy as apostate. And this has a way of shutting down the diversity of thought that is essential for people to progress and to move to understand more enlightened principles as our society evolves. So what do? You end up having to start a fire, create a large noise for anyone to pay attention. You have to embarrass the church. And I say embarrass the church. The church is leaving itself vulnerable to embarrassment. You can't hold on to false, hateful, outdated ideas when society has moved on without being embarrassed when people point out the contradiction between the position that you hold and the more moral and ethical position that society around you has held. In the past, the church has been able to make the argument that society is degenerating in its moral and ethical position on many matters, and it is the stalwart and steady hand of the church that will hold you to true principles. But this episode of the racist history of the church and how the church held on to its racist false ideas for so long shows you that the concept that the church is an unwavering foundation and rock of moral superiority is a falsehood from start to finish. All right. Well, it looks like we don't have any calls. We're approaching an hour, and I'm okay with making this a bit of a shorter episode. The follow-up article to the Lowry Nelson exchange called the Cuba Report to Heber Meeks was one that I'd like to cover next if we can. I may interject a shorter one in there, but it was very eye-opening because a couple of people have done articles on this exchange of papers. You can find it in like Dialogue and BYU Monthly and some of these other things, but I had not encountered anyone that actually went, when you hear that Meeks first brought the attention of Cuba and the question of Cuba to Lowry Nelson's mind, you never go back and say, well, wait a second, what did Meeks actually end up writing to the brethren and how did they respond to that? Well, it took a little bit of hunting, but I was able to find the collected papers of Heber Meeks. And in that, we were able to see the response of the brethren to him and what he sent them. And that is mind-blowing. And so we'll cover that next time. The question of where's the dog, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is too naughty right now. I got to figure that one out. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and close things down, and we will see you next time on Talk on Things and Stuff. Bye now.